to the For All the Saints podcast. I'm delighted to have with me today Stephen Smoot. Stephen, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Appreciate you having me on the podcast.
So great to finally have you on. This is a treat for me, and we're talking about a very fascinating topic today. I'd rather you give us some context on it because I might get it wrong, but maybe you could start by summarizing this newly uncovered Gestapo dossier that's come about and that the B.H Roberts Foundation has done some work on, and why it's kind of an important discovery for us in Latter-day Saint history.
I'd be happy to. So everybody knows the bad guys from Indiana Jones, right? The Nazis. Their infamy needs no introduction. Who these guys are, and I've been working for Josh Coates at the B.H Roberts Foundation for a couple of years now. And I suppose by dint of my having done a German studies degree at Brigham Young University as an undergrad, I can speak and read German. And I've had an interest in both German history generally and Latter-day Saint history in Germany in particular. I was sort of tasked by Josh Coates to research the subject of the history of Latter-day Saints in Nazi Germany, right? It seems like for a lot of people, their interest begins and ends with Joseph Smith or Brigham Young when it comes to Latter-day Saint history. But there's a very rich history of the church, both in North America as well as in Europe, for that matter, right? Over in your neck of the woods there. And so Josh set me to work to do this research on the history of the church in Germany, and specifically in Nazi Germany. So that's the period between 1933 and 1945. And during my research, I came across this sort of archival dossier in the Bundesarchiv, the federal archives in Berlin, Germany. I was aware of one previous author who, in a footnote, cites this material and says, in the federal archives in Berlin, there's a dossier on the Mormons. Nobody else has touched on this material or this content in their published works on the history of the church. So I thought that was kind of weird that like nobody had looked into this besides this one author who just offhandedly in a footnote mentions it. So I got to work. It's funny because Josh was prepared to fly me over to Germany to get a copy of this material, should there have been otherwise inaccessible. And for the first time in my life, I was deeply disappointed with German thoroughness and efficiency because they had digital copies already scanned and put online. So no trip to Berlin for me, unfortunately. But that made it convenient to access this material. And I got to reading it. I got to studying it, translating it. This material obviously is all in German, with a few exceptions, some things in English, but it's predominantly in German. Got to reading and translating, and as I was reading this material, I just kind of realized that this is really important, groundbreaking material that I think in some ways significantly alters our understanding or our contextualized understanding of the history of the church in Nazi Germany. And we can get into that, of course, into the details. So that's what this is. It's basically as you said, a dossier from the Gestapo, specifically from what's called the Sicherheitsdienst. That was the sort of the intelligence agency of the Nazi Party, you could say. But it was part of the SS and the Gestapo. They're all kind of roped in together. It's about 500 pages of content. It includes memoranda, notes, letters, reports, confiscated material, photographs, all sort of stuff here in this archival dossier. It spans between 1933 and 1939, so it actually kind of stops when World War II breaks out. There's one or two documents from like November of 1939. So, right, Germany invades Poland in September of 1939. That is widely considered what kicks off World War II. And the dossier, the documents end around like in November, right? So shortly after the invasion of Poland. But it's no less important for giving us illustrative context of the church in Germany before and even I would say during the war in sort of helping understand what the situation was like. So in a nutshell, that's what this material is. I'll just say up front that you can access this material on the B.H. Roberts website. So if you go to bhroberts.org, I have provided the digital scans and translations of these documents. And if you go to mormoner.org, so that's Mormon, then the letter R, mormoner.org, there's an article that I was one of the lead writers behind on answering questions about Latter-day Saints in Nazi Germany. For anybody who may be a subscriber to the journal Latter-day Saint Historical Studies, published by the Ensign Peak Foundation, I recently just published this. It's the spring 2025 issue of the journal, where the documents are featured, as well as my commentary and analysis on the documents. So this is more kind of geared towards an academic audience for subscribers of this academic journal. But there's also a version that's online that's available on the B.H Roberts website. The content overlaps significantly, so you're not really missing out if you're not subscribed to the journal. I mean, you should. It's a great journal, so you should definitely subscribe to it. But if you don't, you're not missing out because you can get pretty much all the content for free on the B.H Roberts website.
Brilliant. And I'll make sure links to all of those things are down below because it's very worth reading. I read the summary on B.H Roberts Foundation. I flicked through, but I can't speak German, so the summary was a lot more helpful for me, as well as the Mormon article. So they were brilliant. So this report documents this kind of quite intense, surprisingly, Nazi surveillance of the church from about 1933 onward. Two questions on that. What was the extent of the spying, I guess you would say, and what specifically about the church was drawing Nazi suspicion so early in the regime? Was this just a general view of religions, or was there something specific about our church?
Great question. So we can answer them both pretty effectively from the documents. So to answer the first part of your question, the surveillance is throughout Germany. So it's not isolated. It's not a one-off. It is systematic. It is coordinated. It is in multiple cities. It is under multiple jurisdictions, right? So it's throughout the Reich is where the saints are being surveilled and where these reports are coming from. I catalog them both in the published version and online. So it's not just a one-off. So that one's easier, the easiest one to answer. The reason why the Nazis aren't fans of the Latter-day Saints can also be answered from these documents. And that one, you kind of get disparate throughout these different reports. You kind of build a profile of what they don't like about us. And there's a couple of things. Okay, so number one, they don't like the Latter-day Saints, especially because we are an American church with American foreign connections. That is sending off lots of red flags in the minds of Nazi officials, right? Historically in Germany, this tends to sort of be the case. So it's not just the Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, even like the Baptists and the Methodists or the Quakers, right? They all sort of fall under the suspicion of being a foreign origin church in Germany, right? So if you're not a Catholic or a Protestant in Germany, odds are you're going to have some kind of suspicion because of your foreign origin. So that's one thing the Nazis don't like about us. They also don't like the fact that we have a centralized tithing system where money is going from church members to the church and not to the government, right? So this is obviously a big deal for fascist regimes, as controlling the flow of currency and controlling where the money in the business goes. And giving voluntary money to churches and to other organizations is a big red flag for fascist regimes, and that includes the Nazis. So several of the reports talk about the fact that they are suspicious of us because we have this tithing system that we do, right? We have the account, for example, Otto Berndt. We'll get to Helmuth Hubener in a little bit here, I'm sure. Otto Berndt is Helmuth Hubener's district president. And when he's interrogated by the Gestapo, when they arrest him because of Helmuth Hubener's resistance activities, they specifically ask him about tithing, right? And they have this suspicion that like the church forces its German members to pay them 10%, and he has to explain it. It's a voluntary thing, and not everybody even pays tithing anyways, etc. So they don't like us for that reason. Really interestingly is in many of the documents, these Nazi officials are suspicious of Jewish influence. And that's their word. That's their language. Jüdische Einflüsse, Jewish influence on the Mormons and the Mormon church in Germany, right? And so you can kind of see this actually in the tithing system. So the word tithing itself, they are suspicious of. Concepts like Zion and Sabbath and things like that, right? These are Old Testament rooted ideas. That to Nazi officials bespeaks of some kind of a Jewish influence on the Mormons, which of course they take to mean something must be nefarious about this, right? That we are somehow in cahoots with the Jews in some way. The mission leadership or the mission headquarters for the church in Germany, in Berlin, is in this beautiful apartment in central Berlin, very expensive building. the Nazis are suspicious about that because the owner of the building was Jewish. And so they have the suspicion that we're probably in cahoots with Jewish landowners, right, to get sweetheart deals for our real estate and things like that. So they don't like us for that reason, perceived Jewish influence on our theology and on our church practice. Other things that come from the documents. Of course, they think our theology is bizarre and absurd and even sort of deviant, right? So there's this report from 1938 that in-depth details church history and church teachings. It's very garbled, of course, and it has a very clear anti-Mormon bias, but it's pretty thorough. And at the end of the report, they say, like, look, these teachings are so bizarre. It's this weird mishmash from like Buddhism and Islam and Christianity, right? So they're not happy with our theology per se. Of course, there's suspicions that polygamy is still secretly happening and going on. We have some informants, if we want to call them. We have an ex-Mormon who becomes a Nazi, basically, and he goes to the police and he kind of spills the beans on us, right, about how bad and evil our church is. And at one point, he says, like, all the elders in the church, they're given a copy of this book called The Doctrine and Covenants, that your average ordinary members, they don't get the copy of this book. Naturally, right then, right? We don't get us little peons don't get the D&C. Only the elders get the Doctrine and Covenants, and in it talks about polygamy. So like, there's these suspicions about like we think polygamy is still happening amongst church leaders. So in a nutshell, that's what they're worried about. Foreign influence, the fact that we're from the United States, the fact that we're paying tithing to the church, perceived Jewish influence on church teachings and church structure and hierarchy. They think our theology is bizarre or deviant, right? There's suspicions that we're still practicing polygamy. So there's a whole gambit of reasons why they are surveilling us. We are explicitly said to be ideologically incompatible with National Socialism in these documents, which is a great resounding endorsement for our church and our theology, right? When the Nazis themselves are saying, the tenets and the creeds of the Mormons are fundamentally incompatible with the National Socialist worldview. That's almost a direct quote from the 1938 report for Alfred Rosenberg in this dossier. That's a good sign, right? So we have unfiltered and unedited access to what the Nazis think of us, and they're not a fan of us for all those many reasons.
That's interesting because, well, is this just a case of as an official report they don't like us, or is there any insight as to what Nazis thought of church members generally in society? Because the time frame works well with what was happening in the UK as well. There was so much persecution on the saints around that time. It was really only until the kind of 70s where things started to look up for how people in general, normal people, viewed the church. So I'm guessing that must have been the same in Germany during this time and with general Nazi members themselves too.
Right. So you have general sort of German attitudes amongst the general populace towards the church. And again, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, like Seventh-day Adventists, broadly speaking, German society is suspicious of the Latter-day Saints, right? They kind of look at us as this weird foreign, I would say cult. So the term used predominantly throughout these documents and broadly in Germany then and now to describe the church as a Sekte, an S-E-K-T, a sect, right, in German, a Sekte. A Sekte in Germany has both the sense of like a sect, like the legal sense of like it's not a officially recognized church like the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church, right? But sort of culturally, it has the pejorative sense of cult, and it's routinely used that way to describe the church and church members, both in the legal and in the sort of the pejorative sense, right, throughout these documents and in broader German society. We do get a sense, so that's broadly speaking German population attitude towards the Latter-day Saints mostly. We're these suspicious weirdos from the United States, right? That's kind of the feeling, the overall vibe. With the Nazis in particular, we do get individual accounts in like individual police reports. So for instance, these Gestapo members, these Sicherheitsdienst members are going to church meetings and they're observing what we're saying. And you never get like, we love these guys. They're so great. We think they're totally awesome. And we want them here in Germany. It's either just like clinically observant, like, then they said their prayers and their prayers were weird. And then they did this. And then they had lessons on this. And then they read the Bible and then sang a hymn. Or it's like, yeah, these guys are weird. And like, they're not. Another thing that comes out in these reports is they notice the fact that we are not talking about politics in our church. Okay. So at several points they mentioned that it's apolitical, the church meaning that they were spying on, right? There was no mention of any political things going on. Obviously, that's not going to curry a lot of favor with us among the Nazis. The fact that we are not, and we'll get to this later, I suppose, we are not full-throated vocally supporting the regime in our church meetings, and church leaders aren't vocally supporting the regime. That raises suspicion and eyebrows among individual Nazis as well, as they are observing church meetings.
So, how did church leaders kind of toe this line of political neutrality, as you're saying, but also surviving under Nazi scrutiny? What were the kind of actions of church leaders?
Excellent question. That's what a lot of people wonder about and sort of worry about, right? When
Yeah.
they encounter this material, or I should say, when they encounter the history of the church in Nazi Germany. So the official church line, and this is coming from Heber J. Grant to the local mission president to local church leaders. The church's official response to the Nazi regime is this. Actually, let me preface it just quickly before I get into what the answer is. Okay. So let's imagine you wake up one day and it's 1933 Nazi Germany, and you are a religious minority in Germany at the time, okay? Or any other kind of minority, but for our purposes, we'll say religious minority. You have basically three options. Option one, you can vocally oppose the regime, right? You can be an open resistance member. You can vocally criticize Hitler. You can vocally criticize the regime. Some religious groups do this, right? So Jehovah's Witnesses, most famously, they vocally and upfrontly resist and oppose the Nazi regime. We celebrate the fact that Jehovah's Witnesses were brave enough to do this, right? And that they openly oppose the Nazis. The trade-off to that is you go to concentration camps, right?
Yeah.
And the Jehovah's Witnesses were specifically targeted and sent to concentration camps. So that's option one. Option two, you can do what Ludwig Müller did with his Reichskirche, as he called it, the Reichschurch, right? You can be openly, vocally pro-Nazi, and you can try to adapt your Christian message and your Christian teachings to make it conform to the ideology of National Socialism. That will ensure your safety and get you lots of favors with the regime, but it basically will cost you your soul as a Christian if you're going to vocally support a murderous, genocidal dictatorship, right, like the Nazis. So that's option two. You support the regime vocally and openly. You encourage your members to join the party. That will ensure your safety, at least as long as the regime is in power, but it's going to come at the cost of your integrity, your soul, right? Basically, as I can say. Then there's option three, and this is the option that church leaders take, and that is basically an accommodationist policy. By accommodationist, I mean we will recognize the regime, we will submit ourselves to the laws and ordinances and statutes of the regime, we will coexist with the regime, but we will not officially either endorse or oppose the regime, right? So this is accommodationism. This is basically we're going to carve out our own space within the political landscape to try to sort of, if you want to call it a middle ground, you can. I don't think that's exactly the right thing there to call it, but basically we're going to be neutral. We're not going to oppose or support the regime, and we're going to try to live and coexist with it. That's what church leaders do. That's what they encourage church members to do. And the reason they're doing this, of course, is because we have an article of faith that says we believe in being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates, and obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. And so and as a matter of fact, when Nazi officials ask church leaders, local leaders like the mission president and others, what do you think of the government? They cite the 12th article of faith. That's their go-to response. To say, look, we have this article of faith that says we submit to civil authority. We recognize the authority of the state, whatever that state may be, whichever country we're in. And so we're going to do the same for you. We will not oppose you. We are not going to officially, as a church, we're not going to officially oppose you, but also we're not going to officially endorse you. And you don't ever get this official endorsement of the regime by any church leaders, right? So that's the needle that they're trying to thread here, based on the 12th article of faith, and also section 134 of the Doctrine and Covenants. This is the Latter-day Saints' views on government, drafted by Oliver Cowdery, and it's been in the Doctrine and Covenants since 1835. So those texts form the basis for the official church's response, which is accommodation and coexistence without officially condemning or supporting the regime. Now, we can get into what individual Latter-day Saints did, and that's a different conversation, right? Because the response varies from different individual Latter-day Saints. But church leaders from Heber J. Grant up and down, that's their approach. And perhaps we'll get into this more later, but my research from these documents, I believe, strongly indicates that the reason they did this was not because they were just feckless cowards, and not because they like secretly believed in Nazism and they supported the ideology of National Socialism. I'm absolutely convinced from my research that they did this basically as a survival strategy. Okay. And we can see the documents where they are being explicitly targeted and threatened by the Nazis, by the Gestapo, being told if you don't toe the line, if you do anything that's perceived as anti-state tendencies, they call it, you can expect police measures against you, the strictest state police measures. So my argument is that the reason they adopt this approach, it's a survival mechanism to protect the church and to protect church members, specifically living under this totalitarian regime.
So, talking of the individual Latter-day Saints, were there Latter-day Saints who were Nazis, individual ones?
Yes.
And were there quite a lot? I almost think this may be a really stupid point, but I almost think I'm just trying to place myself in the shoes of a faithful Latter-day Saint during that time, hearing during this time that the 12th article of faith being repeated and repeated to me, and wondering then, oh, does that mean I should go and be more active? I don't know. It's hard to say, isn't it? But you know what I mean.
I do know what you mean, yes. And we can answer that. Not just my research, but the research of others. So Roger Minert, a fantastic researcher on Latter-day Saints in Germany. He has a number of great books and articles on this, and he's looked at this specific question. So the short answer is yes, there were individual Latter-day Saints who joined the Nazi Party, okay? Some of them did it clearly out of ideological alignment with what Nazism teaches, okay? One of the most infamous cases is the fact that there was a fellow named Erich Krause who was an SA Sturmbannführer or something, right? Sort of a mid-level SA officer in the Nazi Party. The SA, the Sturmabteilung, was this paramilitary group that the Nazis had, right? The brown shirts, we know them as. So there were some Latter-day Saints that joined the Nazi Party out of ideological conformity with what they taught. There were other Latter-day Saints who joined the Nazi Party, for example, as a legal banality to get employment. So we have examples where, like, your factory job may require you to join the party, for instance,
Wow.
right? Or you may have some kind of a position in your employment that requires you joining the party. So some of them probably joined for that reason, from what we can tell. So there's one Latter-day Saint in Strasbourg who joins the party. I have his name in the book. I can't remember offhand. But from what we can tell, from Roger Miner's research on this guy, he joins because he's like a factory owner, and it was required by law, if you own a company, you have to be a party member or whatever. There's no indication that he joined out of sort of ideological convergence or that he was active in the party. He joined as a legal banality, right? So you have those examples there. Another infamous case is the branch president of Helmuth Hubener. Otto Zander was his name. He was an outspoken vocal Nazi, infamously, right? He put up Juden nicht eintreten, no Jews allowed, in front of the branch building in Hamburg where they were. We have these accounts of him doing these things. So yes, we have to acknowledge that there were individual Latter-day Saints who joined the Nazi Party. Did a lot of them join, you asked, Ben? No. From what we can tell, the weighted average, if you break it up between Latter-day Saints in East Germany versus in West Germany, the weighted average is something like 2.5% of Latter-day Saints joined the Nazi Party, compared to the national average of about 10%. So wow. It's estimated that about 10% of your average German population joins the party, about 2.5% of Latter-day Saints. So that's not a lot. So there's nothing to suggest that like Latter-day Saints were uniquely susceptible to Nazism, or that they were sort of uniquely supportive of Nazism, right? On the contrary, this would seem to indicate otherwise. So individually, yes, you have affiliation with the Nazi Party. Individually, you have Latter-day Saints who have some kind of support for the party and the regime, but that is the exception, not the rule. That does not seem to be widespread among Latter-day Saints, and certainly we don't get any kind of indication where church leaders like Heber J. Grant never tells Latter-day Saints, we want you to join the Nazi Party because we think it's great. You don't get any sort of that indication. They left it up to individual members. As a politically neutral church, they leave it up to their members to join which party they want. Now, they do give guidelines on what they think, which ideologies are and are not incompatible with the gospel and church teachings, but they're never going to officially dictate, we want you to join this or that political party in whichever country.
It's interesting that I was reading on I think it was on the Mormon article, that later, when the war had started, there was a quote in General Conference or something saying, there will be eternal consequences for those people who are warmongering and all of that. And in terms of
Mm-hmm.
like, is that the first kind of thing we see going back to the church's approach and church leaders of a kind of real condemnation of sorts?
Not the first, but it's one of the more like explicit ones. So, leading up to the outbreak of the war, we get individual general authorities, John A. Widtsoe, Levi Edgar Young. We have individual Latter-day Saint leaders, apostles, and other general authorities who vocalize their opposition to both Nazism and communism. Right? Those are the two. Fascism and communism. Those are the two. Uh, Really sort of existentially threatening political ideologies in Europe, and even to a smaller extent in North America at the time. And John A. Widtsoe, he's the president of the European Mission in the mid 1930s, and he explicitly says any political ideology that denies men their right of free agency or infringes on their right to worship or live their lives freely is incompatible with our religion. Okay, so that's like I think 1936. In like 1937, 38, Levi Edgar Young, who's I think he's in the first, the presidency of the 70, he explicitly says, we don't like what the Nazis are doing to the Jews in Europe. We think that what's the situation of the Jews in Germany is deplorable, and we think that the persecution is bad. When the war breaks out in September 1939, a month later, it's General Conference, and the First Presidency officially condemns the war. Right? They famously say, "War and all of its foul brood we condemn as incompatible with the teachings of Jesus Christ." And then in 1943, as the Allies are on the march and as Germany is on its back leg and the war is going to end 2 years later, there is another statement by the First Presidency and General Conference explicitly naming Nazism and communism as ideologies incompatible with the gospel. And yes, they warn of divine punishment and wrath on those who would espouse these ideologies and use them to infringe on the rights and freedoms of other people. So again, we have to be very clear. Even if the church takes officially an accommodationist stance towards totalitarian regimes like the Nazi Party, it is officially condemning the ideology of those regimes. And as a matter of fact, and I'll even read it here because I think it's worth reading, this is not unnoticed by the Nazis themselves. Okay, so we have this report I mentioned. It's this report to Alfred Rosenberg. Alfred Rosenberg is a Reichsleiter. That's like 1 or 2 steps down from the Führer, right, from Hitler. There's only like I think like 12 or 16 of these guys who have this position of Reichsleiter. So Alfred Rosenberg, he's a real bad guy. He's going to hang at Nuremberg, by the way. They're going to hang him for his crimes against humanity. He's like the ideological architect of National Socialism and like the Holocaust. He's the guy that kind of gives the ideological underpinning for this horrible belief system. So he gets a report written to him in 1938. And at the end of it, I won't read the whole report, but I will read the Beurteilung, the assessment that is given at the end of this report. And I want to read it because this is coming from the Nazis themselves, okay? And this is unfiltered. This is for private internal use. So they don't care. They're not concerned about what the public perceives of this. This is their honest, unfiltered, raw opinion of us, right? So among other things, I'll just skip down here. It says, the German leader of the Mormons constantly claims that the sect recognizes the National Socialist state. That's true, right? They recognize the authority of the state, right? And also advocates for it abroad. Now, the local Mormon German leader, probably referring to the mission president at the time, which would have been, I think, Alfred Rees, but I have to double check. It may have been Roy Welker, and recognizes the National Socialist state and also advocates it for abroad. He states that the doctrine of the Mormons and National Socialism are two worldviews that are very similar. Okay, so that's what they note in this report. Here's the next sentence. This is a deliberate distortion of the facts. As is already evident from the previous points, the doctrine of the Mormons is incompatible with the National Socialist worldview. Furthermore, it is a fact that the Mormons in Germany show no interest in political events and current affairs. It is generally known that members of the sect categorically refuse to use the German salute. That's our Nazi salute, right? We all know what that is. It is further proven that the American sect leadership, you catch that? The American leadership, so Heber J. Grant, John A. Widtsoe, these guys, is still shamelessly agitating against National Socialist Germany today. Thus, there can be no talk of a pro-German attitude, right?
Wow.
So, to answer your question, to sort of wrap this all up, yes, church leaders are openly, officially condemning Nazism as an ideology, even if at the same time they are making concessions to the regime and trying to coexist with the regime in Germany. The Nazis see through it. They basically see through the PR campaign that some local mission presidents do to try to make it seem like we can get along, right? They're not buying it. And they know that fundamentally, at its core, the teachings of the church is incompatible with National Socialist teachings, and that the church leadership in America is openly expressing its hostility and disdain towards the Nazis. That report's in 1938. Again, Johnny Widsoe does it in 1936. Levi Edgar Young does it at this time. That's clear from the historical record.
So fascinating. As you talk about those dates as well, this is kind of separate, but I feel somewhat removed from it because of my age and when it happened, even though it's more recent history. And then I thought back to one of my favorite stories of Christmas was by Elder Joseph B. Worthlin, who's shares these beautiful journals of his reflections as he was serving in Salzburg, and in 1939, with the dawn of the war, and kind of at Christmas time in Salzburg, wondering what would happen probably in 1938, the next year, with rumors of wars, and kind of his own spiritual personal reflections as a missionary, a young missionary there, and thinking, gosh, wow, the connection, just what it would have been like to be an American missionary in those areas at that time, just crazy. But one church leader that stands out when you think about the Latter-day Saint history with Nazism is President Heber J. Grant, of course. And you have this kind of famous photo of him preaching in front of a Nazi flag, which is kind of, I guess if you haven't seen it before, it's almost quite shocking. But do the documents reveal anything about what the Nazis felt about his visit to Germany and preaching? Was this quite an important visit, considering he was the president of the church?
Right. So, yes, we do have some documents, both from this dossier and elsewhere, that give us context and understanding of what Heber J. Grant was doing. And I know exactly the photograph you're talking about. I have it in the book, or I should say in this issue of Latter-day Saint Historical Studies. It's on the Mormoner website. It's actually, it kind of upsets me because it's a total cheap shot against Heber J. Grant when you understand the context of this photograph and what was happening. I see people on Reddit and other social media sites post it without any kind of context. It's clearly meant for shock value because it is shocking to see the prophet standing in front of the swastika flag, the Hakenkreuz flag, which is, the most infamous, probably one of the most infamous hate symbols ever. To see him preaching in front of this, it's understandable why people, I think it's meant to be jarring and meant to shock people, but we know the context behind it. So what's the context? Okay, so in the summer of 1937, Heber J. Grant does a tour of Europe. He tours the church in Europe. He goes to England. He goes to your neck of the woods there. He goes to Germany. He goes to Czechoslovakia, right? He goes to Switzerland. So he does a grand tour of Europe the summer of 1937 to meet with local church leaders, to preach to local congregations and so forth. And this includes stops in Germany. So in July of 1937, he's in Germany, and he makes two main stops, one in Berlin and one in Frankfurt, okay? The photograph you're referring to is taken in Frankfurt. If you see it, I'll let you decide if you want to find it and post the image of it here. I mean, well, maybe we could find it. We could share my screen or something if we want to. But basically, you can find it online. Up on a stage, there's a table. Heber J. Grant sitting in the middle. There's some men next to him. They're on the stage of an auditorium, and behind him is a giant swastika flag, right? That's the photograph you're referring to that people find so shocking and jarring. Okay, so it's July 1937. He's preaching in Frankfurt. Who is he preaching to? Well, he's preaching to a crowd of about 1,000 people. So it's a public event, right? It's not just to church members. And also, he's not in a church building. He is in a local rented meeting hall in Frankfurt that was owned by, I think it was like the National Socialist Teachers League. In other words, it was a venue owned by local Nazis. So, of course, it's going to come equipped with the Hakenkreuz flag, which was, at the time, the national flag of Germany. By law, that was the flag of Germany, the national flag of the country. Okay? So, this is not a situation where they specifically put this flag up in a church building because they wanted to show off how much they love the Nazis, and Heber J. Grant specifically wanted it there to, I don't know, somehow signal his support for the regime or something. No, that is not at all what's happening. What's happening is he's speaking in a public venue owned by local Nazis. We have a mix of both members and non-members in the audience. And by the way, we also know from these documents now that the Gestapo was spying on Heber J. Grant. And they have plants in the audience. They have Gestapo plants.
No way.
One of them, when he goes up to Berlin, there's a woman, a Fräulein Pike is her name. She is an informant, a plant for the Gestapo. She's in there. She's taking notes on what Heber J. Grant is saying. Ben, you can imagine it would not go over very well with them if Heber J. Grant, it's like that. It's like that scene from The Sound of Music when Von Trapp tears the flag in half, right? Like if Heber J. Grant had tried something like that with Gestapo agents in the audience, you can imagine how poorly that would have gone for him, right? So this is a situation where, again, to contextualize that photograph, what's happening. By the way, a few weeks previous, Heber J. Grant is in Switzerland preaching to the saints in like Bern and Zurich, I believe. And there's a picture of him standing, and behind him is the Swiss national flag, right? The white cross with the red background. Nobody gets mad at that one. The fact he has the Switzerland flag behind him, why not? Right? It's this, again, I'm not saying they're the same thing. Obviously, the swastika flag is very different. But the point is, he's in another country. He's a guest of that country. This is their national flag. When he's speaking at public events, this is what you have to do. Whenever a head of state, it can be the UK Prime Minister, it can be the President of the United States, when they meet with other foreign dignitaries and they do the photo op and they shake hands, what do you see behind them all the time? There's a row of flags behind them of the two countries, right? And that's not an endorsement of that country's government. It could be China, North Korea, whatever. These countries that we're at odds with right now, it's not an endorsement of that country or their ideology to just stand by the flag when you're in these public events. Okay. So that's the context behind it. What is Heber J. Grant saying at these meetings? That's also important. Okay. Again, did he go over to Germany to tell the saints, I want you to become Nazis. We want to conquer Eastern Europe for Lebensraum. We want to, subject the subhuman Jews. No, there's none of that. There's no political content in Heber J. Grant's speeches. He goes through the articles of faith one by one, and he reads them and he expounds on them. Those are what are in his speeches in both Frankfurt and in Berlin. We know that from the reports of the speeches. We don't have transcripts of the speech themselves, but from both Latter-day Saint reports and from the Nazi reports in the dossier, we know that the content of his speech was apolitical. He was teaching church members and other non-members in the audience what we believe, why we believe it. Now, obviously, he would have come to the article of faith about obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. And in that case, again, we don't know for sure, but probably he would have just repeated what the church's position was, that we recognize civil authorities, we recognize civil governments, and we submit to their laws. And that includes here in Germany. Okay, so hopefully that gives context to this infamous picture of Heber J. Grant, why he's standing in front of a swastika flag. Again, it's a total cheap shot to use this as some kind of gotcha against Heber J. Grant. It's totally out of his control when he's doing this, when he's speaking in these venues. And so we have to fairly judge him by the standards of what's going on at the time with the fuller context. And more important than just the picture of him in front of the flag, what was he saying? We know what he's saying. He's not endorsing Nazism. He's not encouraging Latter-day Saints to become Nazis. He's preaching the gospel and teaching saints how to live their lives in alliance with church teachings.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. It's so interesting to hear about that. I didn't even really know about, before reading all of the summaries, that Heber J. Grant was there preaching at that time as well. So it's all really interesting historical information, even if it's not something that's like, oh, I've stumbled across this on Reddit and I don't know what it is. Like, it's so interesting to go and read anyway. Right. Another church leader that comes to mind is the mission President Welker. Could you tell us about his letters to missionaries during that time and general what missionary work was like during Nazi Germany?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So, and I'm gonna pull open one of the letters here, and we can discuss it. So, Roy A. Welker is mission president of the German-Austrian mission from 1934 to 1937, I think are the dates. Okay, and it's during this time that he is called in by the Gestapo. He's interrogated. They ask him, what's your deal? What are you doing here? What's your teaching? Right. So he gets the interrogation from the Gestapo. And I'm going to read what the Gestapo tells him because we have the memorandum, right? So he meets with the Gestapo on May 5th, or rather it's end of April, but the document's from May 5th, 1936. Okay. So I'll just read it here quickly. Due to the increased advertising activities within the aforementioned sect, the church, by foreign, particularly American missionaries, a meeting with senior representatives of the Mormons was held at the Secret State Police Office on April 30th, 1936. Okay? During this meeting, it was conveyed to the representatives that in the event of anti-state propaganda activities. The strictest state police measures would be carried out against the sect. Did you catch that? Roy Welker is being told explicitly, if you or your missionaries do anything that is perceived as anti-state propaganda activity, meaning if you say anything out against the regime, against Hitler, against our National Socialist ideologies, you can expect the harshest state police measures to be taken against you. When the Gestapo warns you like that, you take it seriously because we know what we know what the Gestapo is capable of, right? We know what these guys are doing to dissidents and people who publicly oppose the regime. Okay. The next sentence, he goes on to say, the representatives promised to issue general directives to individual sects to prevent any intrusive and anti-state propaganda activity by foreign preachers. Okay. So Roy Welker, he gets the memo. He gets the message here. Don't do anything to agitate against the state. Otherwise, you can expect state measures against you. So that's May 1936. And indeed, just a few weeks later, Roy Welker in May, like a week later, on May 6, 1936, Welker issues a general circular letter to church missionaries and local members, right? To the missionaries of the German Austrian mission. That's who this is addressed to. It's sort of a long letter, so I'll just read the relevant part. Talking politics. It is not our province at all to talk politics, to permit ourselves to be questioned about it, or to question others about it, or to be led into discussions of political matters. We are not here for any such purposes, and we can assist this government best by refraining from all political discussions or participation. We are bound by our principles and teachings to honor, uphold, and sustain the laws of the land. Let us be doing it 100%. If anyone attempts to draw you into discussions involving politics, let me repeat, you are to resist such temptation. There are those who would make such attempts to entrap you. Remember that they are your enemies and enemies of the government when they attempt such things. Be not made victims of evil designers. Okay? Did you catch that? This was just a few days later after the Gestapo says, if you do anything to agitate against the government, you're in trouble. And so he tells missionaries, seriously, guys, don't talk about politics. For good measure, he's going to send a copy of this to the Gestapo, and the copy's in the dossier. So on May 15th, he's going to write a letter to these guys with a copy of it. So that's the context for Roy Welker and other church leaders when they instruct missionaries and others, do not discuss politics with people. Again, the older kind of cynical narrative or interpretation was that it's because they're a bunch of spineless cowards that wouldn't stand up for what's right and truth and justice or whatever, right? Well, okay, maybe. Or maybe it's because they have been overtly threatened by the Gestapo that if they do discuss politics and do any perceived anti-state propaganda activities, basically they're going to be thrown in concentration camps. That's the implicit, if not explicit, warning given to them in the documents. So that kind of explains who Roy Welker is and why he adopts the position that he does as mission president, which is, once again, an accommodationist regime, an accommodationist attitude towards the regime. And the documents from the dossier bear that out and contextualize that very well.
So interesting. And the other mission president you mentioned was Alfred Rees. And
yes.
And he wrote this 1939 article in... Am I correct in thinking that it's like the general Nazi Party kind of newsletter kind of thing?
It's the official newspaper of the Nazi Party, the Völkischer Beobachter, the People's Observer, basically. Yeah.
Right. So with this article that kind of tried to get the Nazis to view the church more favorably, was this another kind of just survival strategy for the church there?
That's another very good question. We don't have a lot of context behind Rees's motives for that article in particular. By the way, let me back up and just for our listeners explain what it is. So it's an article titled In the Land of the Mormons, Im Lande der Mormonen, right? And basically what Alfred Rees does is he paints this really rosy picture of life in Utah and what the church is all about, right? And it's explicitly aimed for a Nazi audience, for Nazi readership, because it's in the official newspaper of the Nazi Party, right? And yeah, it's published in... I think it's April 1939, so a few months before World War II breaks out, but leading up to it. And look, I'll be totally blunt and totally frank. In retrospect, this is a very uncomfortable document to read from this mission president,
right.
Because he's very clearly trying to sort of curry favor with the Nazis and portray us in a rosy light for the Nazis, right? He draws these parallels, right? He says like, well, historically the Latter-day Saints were persecuted when we were driven from the eastern United States out to the Great Basin, just kind of like how Germany has been persecuted by other nations in the past, right? Things like this. Again, after 1945, it's very uncomfortable and understandably squeamish when you read stuff like this, trying to make positive parallels. He also makes a big point, Latter-day Saints, we have the word of wisdom where we're encouraged healthy living. That's kind of like what Germans are all about, meaning Nazis, right? We do genealogy. These comparisons are made by Alfred C. Rees and others. He's not the only one. I don't want to pick on him too much. This is just kind of like the most sort of cringy example of it, right? Where a church leader is trying to make favorable comparisons with the Nazis. So, how much of that was because Alfred C. Rees was secretly a Nazi and he really loved the Nazis, versus how much of it was a survival strategy, versus how much of it was basically as a missionary tool? He's trying to build common ground even with really bad people, right? This is a tried and true tested missionary method to try to build common ground with people. I don't think we can say for sure in his case, because we don't have a lot of the documents to contextualize it. I would be very, very doubtful to think that Alfred C. Rees was like a full-throated Nazi. I think that's the least likely explanation, right? That he was secretly pro-Nazi or something. I think the more likely explanation is, as mission president, he was perhaps a little overzealous in trying to find common ground with the people his missionaries were reaching. And that this was an opportunity for that. We do have indication that after that article got published, it was then reprinted as a pamphlet, and missionaries were handing it out to people. Actually, that got church members in trouble because the republished pamphlet version had the Reichsadler, the eagle with the swastika in its talons. Right, we've seen this Nazi logo. It republished it with the official Nazi sort of logo, if you will, and that got local Nazi officials upset that they were sort of unofficially co-opting that logo. So it's being used as a missionary pamphlet after it appears in the newspaper, and there's a pamphlet version of it. That's what leads me to probably believe that most likely it was meant to be a proselyting tool. It was meant to try to build common ground. Again, very cringy. We can be honest about that. It's not a good look, as the kids say, to try to be favorably comparing yourself with the Nazis. But in the context of its time, I think we can afford a little bit of grace to Alfred C. Rees for what he was trying to do, which wasn't to be a full-throated Nazi supporter, but try to build common ground with people he was trying to proselyte. We have anecdotal reports from some of these missionaries that it had a positive effect for their missionary work. We have accounts from missionaries saying after President Rees published his article, we had a lot more success in our proselyting activities, right? So that's what I suspect was going on with that particular document in its context.
Staying on the theme of missionaries, am I right in thinking that it was Latter-day Saint missionaries who trained the German basketball team for the Olympics? Is that true?
Yes, they had a role in that. And so 1936 Berlin Olympics, basketball is this new kind of American sport still, right? It's not big in Europe. I don't know if it even is big in Europe today. You could tell me, Ben. I know football.
No, it's not really.
European football is a big thing there, right? Not American football. No. But I don't know if basketball is per se. But yes, in 1936, in lead up to the Berlin Olympics, Latter-day Saint missionaries were tapped to teach basketball to the national team of Germany. Again, the cynical, I would say bad faith interpretation of this is that they did it because they were secretly pro-Nazi or they were cool with the Nazis or, whatever. Again, I think that's absurd in the extreme to say that they were teaching Nazis basketball because they loved Nazis. Rather, and actually we don't have to guess in this case, we have explicit statements from the missionaries themselves who go on to write accounts both for the improvement era and their own private accounts, right? Their own oral histories. They did it as a proselyting tool. Right? They did it to build common ground. They did it to build bridges. They did it to make connections and to sort of help overcome the stereotype that Germans had that Latter-day Saints are a bunch of basically insular cultists that aren't compatible with our culture, our society. So again, if you want to sort of criticize them for helping teach the German team basketball, fine, I guess you can. I just think their stated explicit reason why was not to promote Nazism, but to promote the gospel and to find ways where they could introduce the gospel to people. And again, from the accounts from missionaries, it worked. From their accounts, this was a good way to sort of break the ice and build bridges and make inroads in German culture. Again, hopefully that better contextualizes it. But yes, it's true that Latter-day Saint missionaries played a role in helping teach basketball to the national team of Germany for the Berlin Olympics.
Fascinating stuff. Something that really stands out to me when learning about this was the banning or confiscating of James E. Talmage's book Articles of Faith. That that seems quite striking to me. And well, could you share the context around that confiscation, and were there any other things from Latter Day Saint literature that was banned? And I'm just wondering, like from a Nazi perspective, why would a theological text have been perceived as a threat by the Nazis? That seems strange to me, especially this book.
Right. So, yes, I can address that because one of the documents in the dossier addresses the banning of the Articles of Faith by James E. Talmage. By the way, that happens to be one of my favorite books ever written by a general authority, is the Articles of Faith by James E. Talmage. It's an all-time classic. It's banned in July of 1936. And we knew that it was banned previously from the minutes of the mission history. Okay, so the German-Austrian manuscript history kept by the mission mentions that in this month it was banned. But now, from the dossier, we know who banned it. And it was
Ah,
banned by the president of the Reich Literature Chamber. This is one of the guys acting under Joseph Goebbels in his propaganda ministry.
wow.
Okay, so this is coming from the highest authorities to ban this, to put it on quote, a list of harmful and undesirable literature is what they put it on. So the official Nazi ban list. Okay, um, why did they ban it? Okay, actually, the document doesn't explicitly say why, so we have to infer. But there's some pretty good inferences we can get from why they wanted to ban it. I think the big reason why they wanted to ban it was because Elder Talmage has multiple chapters on the gathering of Israel and the building of Zion, right? These are in our articles of faith. We believe in the restoration of the lost 10 tribes of Israel and the literal building of Zion on the American continent. Israel and Zion, those are, again, quote, Jewish influences, right, on our theology. So I suspect that is why they banned it, or primarily why they would have banned it, was because Elder Talmage has a very pro restoration of Israel, pro Zion kind of attitude. You can imagine, Ben, how that would not go over well with the Nazis to have a book that's like actively promoting pro Israel stuff, right? So I suspect that's why. But we can't know for sure. That may have been the biggest reason why. Yes, other literature is also banned or confiscated. So actually, a sizable chunk of the dossier itself is publications that have been confiscated and copied and included in the dossier. So mostly these are missionary tracts, stuff missionaries were handing out. The other sort of example, there's a tract called Divine Authority, Göttliche Vollmacht, or something like that. It again, for some weird reason, it shows up on this list of banned books, and the manuscript history of the mission mentions it was banned. And indeed, there are confiscated copies of, I believe, that particular pamphlet in the dossier. So, censorship of literature. I mean, this is textbook Nazism, fascism, right? It's not just us they do this to; they do it to plenty of other people. But we get on the list, and no less than Elder Talmage in his Articles of Faith gets on the list. Again, I suspect because of its perceived pro-Jewish attitude or influence on its teachings.
Were the members still able to get the kind of basic communications and manuals and things from the Central Church? Because I know when you hear about President Nelson and President Monson's, you know, Iron Curtain work, a lot of the manuals and stuff, it was so hard to get them through. Was that a similar case in Germany at the time?
So at least up until the war breaks out. So once the war breaks out, they withdraw all the American missionaries and leadership of the mission from Germany, right? There's that famous movie Escape from Germany that just came out a year or two
Yeah,
ago. I don't know
yeah.
if you've seen it. It just came out recently, where they portray this, where the missionaries were evacuated from Germany. So once the war breaks out, communication between the churches severed, and then like super duper by December 1941, when Germany declares war on the United States, that's when there's like a total communication vacuum, and local church leadership is entirely in the hands of German Latter-day Saints. Up to that point, however, it typically what's going on is literature is being produced in the United States, and then it's being brought over to other countries like England, Denmark, Sweden, Germany, and local church leaders or mission leaders will translate it into their local languages for local
Right.
distribution, right? So this is before the era of correlation. This is before we have a church-wide effort to systematically correlate and publish all church literature throughout the church, throughout the world, right? So before that, you have sort of localized efforts to translate materials from English into the local language. That seems to be the case in Germany. So literature still is being produced in Germany up until the outbreak of the war. They have like a journal, right? Der Stern, the Star, which is, well, over in England, you guys had the Millennial Star, right, going
Yeah.
all the way back to the 1840s. You still had it up into the 1960s or something. Germany had the Star. Scandinavia had the Star. That was sort of the Latter-day Saint periodical. Local German mission leaders are translating literature. So Jesus the Christ, Articles of Faith, stuff by Joseph Fielding Smith. This gets translated into German and other local languages. That's more kind of the procedure. So we don't so much have the situation, right, where President Monson has to memorize the handbook and he goes into East Germany and then from memory he writes it down to distribute it to local church members. That level of censorship was not in place in Germany in the 1930s. But that's also partly because the procedure wasn't so much what we do today, but it was more a localized effort to get this material into the hands of church members. And so that way they could probably skirt around the state censors that way. But obviously they didn't escape at all, since some of them still ends up getting censored.
So how close did the church actually come to being like fully outlawed in Nazi Germany?
Pretty close. It never actually happens. So the church is never officially banned. Some other groups are Jehovah's Witnesses, I believe Seventh-day Adventists, right? So there are other religious minorities that are officially banned. We come close, but it doesn't happen to us. In the dossier, there are documents discussing if they should ban the church, and this goes all the way up to the office of Joachim von Ribbentrop. He's basically the foreign minister of Nazi Germany. He's the ambassador, right, to both the Soviet Union and England in the 1930s. So von Ribbentrop's office, the Ribbentrop Bureau, they have conversations about if we should ban the Mormon sect, as they call it, right? There are local police memoranda saying, hey, man, the missionaries are such a nuisance here. And so many people are complaining that we think we should ban them. So there's also local discussions in local jurisdictions, but it also gets to the higher ranking government officials as well. But it never actually happens. And I wonder, in the academic version of this, I wonder why was it not banned, despite the fact that we have multiple documents and people calling for the church to be banned. I think the answer, there's two parts to the answer of why. Part number one is, I think, because of our accommodationist strategy the church leaders encouraged. Whether you like that policy or not, it seems to have worked to have its intended effect of not painting a target on the church's back for the regime to target it, like it did Jehovah's Witnesses or others. Okay, that's the first reason why. The second reason why, and this one actually is in the documents, it's mentioned, we're a small church, a small religion in Germany. So in 1933, we have about 8,000 members in Germany. And by 1939, we have about 13,000, a little over 13,000 members. Okay. And they even say, so in this memorandum for the Ribbentrop Bureau, they even say, we're not concerned with the smaller sects like the Mormons. We're going to target the larger groups first, with the implication that eventually we'll get to the smaller groups, right? We have anecdotal accounts from guys like Otto Berndt, once again, Helmuth Hubener's district president, where he says when he was interrogated by the Gestapo that at one point the guy interrogating him, he said, once we've won the war and once we've solved the Jewish question, right, this sinister euphemism for the genocide of the Jews, once we've solved the Jewish question, once we've won the war, you Mormons are next. Right. So he
Wow.
gives us now that could have been a threat or a bluster during the interrogation, but he could have meant it. Right. Like the documents we have indicate that we were on their radar for potentially being banned. And so maybe that was in consideration even that late into the war, perhaps not. I should say quickly to clarify that we don't have evidence that Latter-day Saints are targeted like Jews or other groups on the systematic genocidal scale, right? So there's no wide-scale genocide of Latter-day Saints in Nazi Germany like with Jews and other minority groups. But there seems to have been indication that they were heading in that direction. And had Germany come out victorious in the war, who's to say what the situation of the church would have been after that, right?
Wow.
Obviously, thank goodness, Germany loses the war and freedom is returned to Germany, and the church is able to flourish and survive in Germany after the war. Things may have been different had history turned out differently based on some documents we have.
Were any Latter-day Saints sent to concentration camps? And it kind of brings up that question too of Helmuth Hubener. And there was also another big example mentioned in the document? I can't remember the name. It's a German name, but these
Yeah.
examples of resistance from Latter-day Saints.
So yeah, the guy you're talking about, yeah, let's address this one at a time here. So your first question, were there Latter-day Saints sent to concentration camps? Yes, we have a few cases of Latter-day Saints being sent to concentration camps. The ones that we know about, for example, are church members in Hamburg. So there's one church member, he's of like Eastern European or even Russian descent. He's also of Jewish descent. So he's an Ostjuden, you would call an Eastern Jew, right, coming from Eastern Europe. He migrates to Germany. He joins the church in Germany. He's in Hamburg. He is sent to a concentration camp where he perishes. I'm sorry, I don't remember his name. It's Solomon. I want to say Solomon Schwartz, I think was his name, but I could be mistaken. But it was Solomon something was the name of this Latter-day Saint who perished. There is another Latter-day Saint also from Hamburg who spoke, and he's in the account from Otto Berndt and others involved with Helmuth Hubener. He spoke out during the war. He made a sort of a sarcastic comment. They erected, I guess, some sort of a war monument to fallen soldiers in Hamburg. And this Latter-day Saint, he said, oh, look at that. Even butchers are getting war memorials now or something. Some ill-advised, offhanded, sarcastic comment that somebody overheard reported him. He's sent to a concentration camp. He's released from that camp, and then he dies from the injuries he sustained in the camp shortly after his release. I don't know beyond those two examples of others. I'm sure there may have been, but offhand, I'm not aware of documentation. Probably some of these Latter-day Saints that ended up in concentration camps kind of, quote, got lost through the cracks, as it were, since Latter-day Saints are a minority group. And specifically, there's not like a category for Latter-day Saints or Mormons. So when you go to a concentration camp, you're going to get some kind of an identifying offense. Either you're Jewish, you're Romani or Gypsy, you're a homosexual, you're a political dissident, whatever. There's no specific category for like Latter-day Saint or Mormon, right? So they would have been categorized probably under one of these other categorizations of offense for going to the camp. So we can't know for sure. But there are examples of a few Latter-day Saints who end up in concentration camps. Maybe we'll talk about Helmuth Hubener in just a little bit, because I want to mention the other guy that you mentioned. His name is Paul Herbert Sheik. And he deserves to be mentioned because his story appears nowhere else in the literature on the church in Germany or Nazi Germany. And this guy's a hero. And he
so this
deserves
was
to be
only
remembered.
in these documents. This was kind of the first. Wow, interesting.
This is the first place where I have found anybody mention this guy, and it's from these documents. Okay, so again, it goes to show you that people can slip through the cracks of history, and we don't know about them until the documentation shows up, either by accident or otherwise. So let me read. This is a police report reporting the Paul Herbert Sheik. He was arrested in 1936, July of 1936. Okay, June of 1936. Here's the report. To assess the attitude of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, towards the state and the people, I report the following incident. At a communal reception of the Führer's speech on March 27, 1936, the toolmaker Paul Herbert Sheik, born May 8, 1906, in Freiburg, residing in Freiburg, Domgasse number 2, so his address, he did not raise his hand for the German salute at the conclusion of the broadcast and did not sing the national anthem or the Horst Wessel song. That's basically the Nazi national anthem, the Horst Wessel Lied, right? So at the end of their work meeting, they listen to Hitler speak, and everybody gives the Nazi salute, and they start singing the national anthem and the Horst Wessel Lied. And this guy, Paul Herbert Sheik, does not do that. For that, he was arrested, okay, because he refused to participate in these Nazi gestures or rituals. The accused Sheik stated to the interrogating police officer, and then we have his account. Okay, you ready? So this is his firsthand statement to the police why he refused to participate. When a communal reception was ordered for the entire factory on March 27, 1936 at 4 p.m., I went to the designated hall. After the Führer's speech, the entire workforce rose and began the national anthem and Horst Wessel song while raising their right hands. I neither sang nor raised my hand during this. My reason for it is thus. Okay? My reason for it is thus. I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As such, I support the establishment of the Kingdom of Zion. It contradicts my personal beliefs to serve both Zion and another Reich. The Mormons intend to establish and build a Zion that is free from national ties. It is meant to be a kingdom under the rule of Jesus Christ, to be established on the American continent. Nevertheless, I feel that as a German I am subject to the Führer, but consider Zion to be the highest ideal. I find only a contradiction between the goals of Zion and the national anthem and the German salute, and therefore my inner convictions. I have no further explanation to give regarding my behavior yesterday. Signed, Herbert Sheik.
Wow.
That's why he refused to give the Nazi salute and sing the national anthem, is because he says, as a Latter-day Saint, I believe in Zion, and Nazi ideals contradict my belief in Zion, and therefore my beliefs as a Latter-day Saint. So for that, he's arrested. He loses his job. Fortunately for him, he is not sent to a concentration camp because at that time, Hitler had passed a general amnesty for low-level offenders. Okay, so lucky for him, he did this at a time when Hitler had passed a general amnesty. Had he done this a few years later, a few years before, who's to say what would have happened to him? But at this time, he was released from custody, but he did lose his job for this. So, like, guys like that need to be remembered, right? And I want history to remember Paul Herbert Sheik. I want the Saints to remember this guy. Helmuth Hubener is the hero we all know. We can talk about him, but we need to remember there were others as well. Max Reschke is another Latter-day Saint. He saves Jews during Kristallnacht, the horrible pogrom on Jews the Nazis do in 1937, I think it was. So there's other Latter-day Saints as well that join in the resistance in small and big ways. It's not just Helmuth Hubener. And their stories need to be recognized and balanced against the examples of Latter-day Saints who may have picked the wrong side on this sort of thing, right? And those who align themselves with the Nazis. So do we want to talk about Helmuth Hubener for a little bit, perhaps? Or is there something else we want to address before we jump onto that subject? Because he's kind of the big example people wonder about when we talk about the church in Germany.
Yeah, let's dive into him. Let's hear his story.
Okay, so Hubener is not in these documents because, like I said, they end in 1939. But his story is well known. Several books have been written about him, documentaries. There's a movie coming out that Angel Studios is doing about him, right?
Yeah, I saw that.
He is recognized, I believe, I could be mistaken, but I believe he is still recognized as officially the youngest resistance member against the Nazis to be murdered by the Nazis.
Wow.
And so within German society today, he's remembered with great reverence for his anti-Nazi activities, besides just in the church. So who is Helmuth Hubener? So Helmuth Hubener is a Latter-day Saint in Hamburg, Germany. Okay, he's a teenager. And as a teenager, he and his friends, he has 2 or 3 friends, including members of his local branch that he's a part of. They are illegally listening to BBC radio broadcasts, and they are transcribing these radio broadcasts, and they are turning them into leaflets and distributing anti-Nazi, anti-Hitler leaflets in the war. So this is 1942 when they're doing this. Okay, they get caught, and they are arrested. I believe it's February of 1943 is when they're caught and arrested. And Hubener will be executed later that year. He will be put on trial. There's this infamous, it's called the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court. It's this infamous, you've seen movies about it. This Roland Freisler was this judge, this horrible human being who would scream at these people, right? He would humiliate them. And it was a kangaroo court, right? It's the show of justice when there's already predetermined conclusion that these people are guilty and we're just going to mete out the punishment. So Hubener is convicted by the People's Court, the Nazi People's Court, and he's executed in the infamous Plötzensee prison in Berlin in late 1943. He's actually executed. He's beheaded by guillotine, right? Which is very grisly to consider. They were still doing that in the 20th century. But so he's executed. His friends, they receive prison sentences, and fortunately, Germany loses the war, and so they're released. They gain their freedom. Some of them, like Karl-Heinz Schnibbe, and he has another friend whose name escapes me. They migrate to the United States. They're faithful, active Latter-day Saints their entire life. He also had 1 or 2 non-Latter-day Saint friends that helped him in this. So that's who Helmuth Hubener is. He's this resistance member. He's a martyr. He was a faithful Latter-day Saint. In fact, towards his execution, he writes letters to his family and some friends. And one of the things he says to a letter to, I believe it's his grandmother, or it could be somebody else in the branch. He wrote a few of them. He says, one of his last things says, I'm very sad I have to break the word of wisdom in the final moments of my life, right? Because they gave him wine or whatever to drink as part of his last meal. So he's very much, and he says, like, I will stand before God and he will judge of my actions or whatever, right? So Hubener dies a faithful saint. So that's his story. He deserves to be remembered as a hero because he was, and I'm looking forward to the movie that's coming out about him. The reason why Hubener is a controversial figure for some is not because of what his actions, but because of the actions that church members and leaders took in reaction to his resistance efforts in Germany. So I mentioned earlier that Hubener had a branch president named Otto Zander. He was a Nazi, a full-throated, vocal pro-Nazi, his local branch president. Um, he, Otto Zander, and a local mission leader named Anton Huck, they signed an excommunication warrant for Hubener and posthumously excommunicated him. Okay, so his local leaders excommunicate him, and we'll get to the reason why in a second here. And people have taken that, again, it's decontextualized and it's unfair. It's a cheap shot. They have taken that to say, oh, look, see, the Mormon church excommunicated anti-Nazi dissidents during World War II. And that shows how rotten and bad the church is to its core, because it's excommunicating its dissident anti-Nazis. Paul Herbert Sheik wasn't excommunicated. Why was Helmuth Hubener excommunicated? Okay. We get insight into why this was, besides the fact that he has a pro-Nazi branch president. We get insight into this from Hubener's district president, Otto Berndt, who has an unpublished, untranslated memoir. I saw a copy. It's in church archives. I translated portions both for the website and for this new work I've done. Otto Berndt is interrogated by the Gestapo because Hubener used church equipment as part of his anti-Nazi efforts. He used a typewriter that was owned by the church to type up his leaflets. So the Gestapo is convinced that there are others besides just these teenage boys involved with it. It must be his church leaders. And so his church leaders are targeted as potential collaborators in this anti-Nazi resistance effort. And so Otto Berndt is hauled into Gestapo headquarters. He's interrogated for multiple days. And in the course of this interrogation, he is told, if you will excommunicate this boy, that will be a signal that what you're saying is true, that he was acting on his own and other local church members or leaders weren't involved. And so even though Otto Berndt opposed excommunicating Hubener, he relented to it and allowed it to happen because he thought it would signal to the Gestapo, who are breathing down the necks of the church members in Hamburg, that he acted alone and he did not act with church authority. Go back with me, Ben, to 1936, when the Gestapo told Roy Welker, if you or your members do anything perceived as anti-state activity, you can expect the strictest police state measures against you. This would be a time to make sure that the Gestapo knows that this kid was acting on his own and other church members or leaders were not participating with him, besides the ones obviously that were, right? Besides his co-conspirators or his collaborators, right? So the context for his excommunication, it's partly because his branch president was a Nazi who wanted him excommunicated. It's also because other anti-Nazis like Otto Berndt, who did not like the regime and who were themselves a target, they went along with it and they saw the wisdom in it for the purposes of protecting the church and other church members in Hamburg, to show them that he acted alone and he did not have official church sanction for his activities, right? So that's really important context on both sides to understand why he was excommunicated. Fast forward to 1948, okay? Germany loses the war, the Allies win the war. Contact is reestablished with the church in Germany, and church leaders are able to assess what's the situation for the church in Europe. Famously, right, Ezra Taft Benson goes and he meets with church members in Europe to find out what's going on. Other church leaders go to reestablish contact. Remember, after 1939, the church is basically on its own in Nazi Germany. We don't have any American leadership or oversight from the church in Utah over what's happening in Germany. Communication's been cut off. Once they find out after the war that Hubener was excommunicated by his branch president and what had happened with this, on the recommendation of other local mission leaders like Max Zimmer, who was tasked to go through in Germany and assess the situation, on his recommendation, the first presidency overturns that excommunication and posthumously restores Hubener's blessings, and he later goes on to receive posthumous temple blessings, right? So this is clearly not a case of church leaders in Salt Lake City, Heber J. Grant and others, because they were so ardently pro-Nazi, they hated it when Hubener participated in this, and so they excommunicated him. They had no idea what was happening until after the war. It was his local church leadership that was doing this for the reasons I've explained. And that helps us explain both Hubener is and the fallout of what Hubener did for the church, for the saints in Germany, right? So long story short, that's who Helmuth Hubener was. Again, there's excellent treatments. I cite them both in the Mormon article and in my treatment here. You can read the accounts from his collaborators, from his friends, from his church leaders like Otto Berndt, who left accounts of what happened. He deserves to be remembered and praised as a hero, absolutely. We rightly recognize Hubener, but we also need to understand the fuller context of some of these controversial actions taken after Hubener's activities and what they were and what they may or may not fully signify. And we need to avoid, I think, the cynical, bad faith interpretation of these events that some have propounded.
It all raises this question in my mind, Stephen, of, you know, there was all this heavy surveillance documented. There was this ideological incompatibility clearly from both sides, and yet the church survived. And I wonder, what does that teach us in your mind about this kind of intersection of faith, but also politics and authoritarianism?
I can speak to that from one of two angles. The first angle I can speak to as a historian, right? And I can say, well, based on the documents that we have and the evidence available, they survived because of these reasons. And those reasons being that basically their strategy worked, which was that we will accommodate and coexist with the regime. Hopefully this will not paint a target on our backs and we can protect ourselves and our church members, right? So that seems to have worked, just from a strictly prosaic kind of cause and effect, consequences of history angle. From the vantage of me as a believing faithful Latter-day Saint, I believe the reason the church survived in Germany is because the Lord protected the church in Germany. And whatever the faults or the mistakes or the questionable choices some church leaders may have made along the way, and I acknowledge there are some. Again, like I said, it's really cringy to read mission presidents saying favorable, cozying up with the Nazi stuff, right? Like, that's very uncomfortable. We can recognize that and be honest about that. But overall, I think the Lord was directing his prophet and his saints on how to navigate this horrible situation of being trapped in a violently genocidal, fascistic, evil regime that was targeting people, that was murdering people, that was stripping them of their rights, the rights of liberty, the rights of worship. I think the Lord guided his saints through that situation and guided his leaders, whatever their imperfections or whatever sort of questionable steps along the way some church members or leaders may have taken. So that's how we don't have to just do it by Nazi Germany, by the way. We have the history of the church in communist East Germany and the Eastern Bloc, right? We even have the history of the church in authoritarian regimes in South America, right? Even the church today in Russia. I hope I'm allowed to say it, but I think most people would recognize Russia is a politically authoritative state these days. And we have church members in Russia. And in fact, the Russian government has taken actions against the church. Certain church freedoms have been restricted for members in Russia. You can't openly proselyte in Russia, for example, right? So we still navigate these situations historically and today. And I think in each case, the Lord is directing his saints on how best to survive and navigate these difficult situations. So that's how I would answer it from a Latter-day Saint perspective. So from a historical perspective, the church survived because their strategy basically worked. From a Latter-day Saint perspective, I think it's because that's what the Lord was directing his saints to do at the time to best navigate this. I think I do want to say one more thing, and then we can wrap up here, I know, because I don't want to filibuster too much. We have a lot of luxury and comfort 80 years later to look back on history of, especially during this horrible period of Nazi Germany, and to kind of Monday morning quarterback on, okay, what they should or should not have done, right? And we say this from the safety of not having ourselves to face down the barrel of the gun, as it were, both literally and metaphorically, of a totalitarian regime that won't just throw you in a concentration camp. They'll throw all your friends and family with you in a concentration camp if you speak out against the regime, right? And so I want to read what Otto Berndt said, and I quote this at the end of my published version of this. So again, Otto Berndt, he cannot by any metric be said to be pro-Nazi. He was targeted by the Nazis, right? But he said this: "Let it be said that the saints who believed in the ideals of the new Germany did like Saul of Tarsus in persecuting the Christians. They did what they did because they believed it to be in the best interest of the church and the country. Repentance and forgiveness have been manifested by all concerned after the war." So that's where I would like to leave things. This is not to excuse the horrible evils the Nazis did by any means. This is not to excuse the awful genocide or any of that bad stuff. but rather to acknowledge that individuals in Germany, both Latter-day Saints and others, but we'll say Latter-day Saints, individual Latter-day Saints in Nazi Germany, they had a really difficult choice in front of them. Some of them were brave, like Helmuth Hubener and Paul Herbert Schiek. Others aligned themselves with the regime, like Arthur Zander. I think most of them, however, just honestly struggled to navigate and did the best they could under these bad circumstances. And depending on your degree of what they did, right, may have made mistakes or may have done what they could. Anyways, you get what I'm saying here, right? I don't want to filibuster on this too much. I like that perspective from Otto Baunt. If anybody had a right to be mad at his fellow church members for in any way aligning themselves with the regime, it was Otto Baunt. But he doesn't take that track with them. And so as myself as a Latter-day Saint, that's the track I try to take as well, to approach this with faith, hope, and charity. Hold the guilty parties accountable for what they did that were bad, for their crimes against humanity. But I think those are the extreme cases. In most cases, it doesn't rise to that level. And so we can afford a bit of charity and good faith to these individuals. We don't have to jump on the cynical side of things or the cynical interpretation of things, which I see predominantly. And I think that these new documents help better buttress that position that I take and provide a fuller context for why I take that position.
I totally agree. Thank you for sharing that. And thanks for coming on, Stephen. I'm grateful to you for the research that you've done with B.H Roberts Foundation. I think what you've done really challenges and corrects a lot of previous assumptions of the church's stance during this era. And, there are some really cynical takes and it's great to read. It's interesting historically, but also it's faith promoting as well. But mainly interesting to learn about all the surveillance going on. It's that interested me and learning about that. So all that to say, I'm really grateful for the work you've done on this and grateful for you coming on the podcast and sharing it with all of us.
The pleasure is all mine, Ben. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. And all the links for people wanting to read more will be in the description. And thanks again, Stephen. Take care. Thanks for watching For All the Saints. This show needs your help to grow. Please like the video, comment your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone you think would enjoy it. Thank you.